Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I had my periodic check-in with my oncologist for my leukemia yesterday. Went fine. My bad numbers were up a little, but nothing drastic. I've got a sinus infection going on, which may have contributed to the result. She is a little concerned that I seem more susceptible to infections in the past year or so. So it might be a related symptom to what I've got, and there might be a immunoglobulin infusion in my future. But we'll see. 3 months till the next exam. It's another reset of the clock. So I'll take it. But there's something funny I want to talk to you guys about. It's a little weird, as you have come to expect from me. It is about doppelgangers and my doubles. See, a work pal sent me a photo of a musician he saw performing last week, and he thought the guy looks like me, had to do a double take, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't look that much like me, but whatever. But I did add it to the folder of pictures that people have sent me over the years of the various doubles I have. The all-time funniest was last fall when Eddie Campbell sent a pic of me side by side with the young Gandalf character on that Amazon Lord of the Rings show, because he and his wife watching the show said he looks like, and the next one blurted out Gil. And so anyway, it's kind of funny, I guess. And these things, I mean, they're always appreciated for a laugh, I'll say. And I have to say, met some real doppelgangers of mine over the years, and the thing I want to tell you is they don't look anything like me. That's kind of the point. This week's guest is one of them. See, there are these, I'll say men, maybe there are women too, but I've only met men whose lives sort of mirror mine, or could have been mine, with, different choices, accidents of birth, that stuff. And when I meet them and when we talk and when I start discovering these resonances, I see these facets of myself, these sparks from the emanation, I guess, that we share, if you get me. It happened last year when I recorded with Shalom Oslander. Between the book that we were discussing, Fe, his memoir, and our conversation as it progressed, some of it was geographic, but there was a lot of other things going on that told me this was somebody who I could have been or could have been me in different circumstances. Coincidentally, another one of those guys is Rabbi Zvi, Chabad rabbi from the same area that Shalom is from in Spring Valley, New York. And it's that thing where, born in a different place, raised with different parents or values, and, who knows whether we'd resemble each other more or less. But guys like that are my doppelgangers, not these men with long faces and skinny bodies and stubble or beards or long hair or whatever it is that triggers that in my the people who send me these funny pictures. But yeah, this week's guest, Seth Lorinczi, he's one of those doppelgangers of mine, I think. I don't know if he picked up on that during our conversation, but I kind of think he did. Seth's got his first book out. It's called Death Trip, a post-Holocaust psychedelic memoir. It's from Spiral Collective Press. And it's about how journeying into psychedelics as part of couples therapy led him to some big realizations about his father's family history in Hungary during the war, and how their trauma transmitted to him all these years and what he could try to do to fix it, not just for himself, which we'll get into. Death Trip is it's a brave and honest book, and it really displays those scenes from a marriage that nearly lead to a divorce. He is pretty unsparing about his failings as a husband and a person, in terms of putting that down on the page, and he does it without being coy and trying to wink at the reader or eliciting pity or anything or self-pitying. He really just shows a man and his partner in life both kind of flailing in ways. And he does it in a way that I have to say it's a real accomplishment. The honesty without the artifice, I guess, or the artificiality, I'll say. So Death Trip, it does this great job of conveying Seth's experiences with psychedelics and how they impact his life. I mean, I'm taking him at his word here, because as we talk about during the show, I am psychedelic naive. I have virtually no drug experience whatsoever. Also, as we get into, my recent meditation practice might be arcing toward that stuff without needing any chemical thing, but we talk about that too. So, but as he and his wife proceed through the course of the first half of the book, from their strife to MDMA therapy to ayahuasca to Toad, Toad, we see him really come to terms with the patterns of behavior that were making him unhappy, and to the changes that he has to make in his life and his marriage, and the ways his life is woven into this bigger tapestry of family and world history and trauma. And this journey triggers a trip of another kind. His visit to Budapest comprises really the second half of the book, where he tries to learn more about his father and his family and the world that surrounded them and the world that has replaced it in the present. And he comes to learn really what it means to be raised by survivors, and what the difference is, as we talk about, between survival and living. And for that part of the book, the psychedelics drop away, but the lessons they've imparted, those things remain. And you see how that wisdom sticks around beyond the ayahuasca rituals and the other medicines that he takes. It's a really fantastic memoir. I had no idea what to expect. He reached out to me, having heard about the podcast, and I am pretty impressed, especially because it's his first goddamned book. So anyway, go check out Death Trip, a post-Holocaust psychedelic memoir. You'll learn a lot, not just about the psychedelic medicine and the way that sort of stuff is conducted, but the ways we can kind of reframe our lives. And again, the ways we can, as he puts it, metabolize the trauma, not just that we carry, but that our family and our ancestors carry. Anyway, as caveats go, there's New York City noise. That happens. We recorded on the Lower East Side. I also do a lot of gabbing in this one, but that's what happens when I get doppelgangered like this, I also had this blinding headache from that sinus infection I mentioned earlier. Astute listeners may pick up on that in my voice. Also, it comes near the end, but I do want to say Billy Childish, who Seth references, has written for Mineshaft magazine. That's what I meant, because I knew I'd heard his name or seen his name before. He's shown up in Mineshaft, which is a great magazine or zine that you really need to look up and start subscribing to. Anyway, I was not wrong in that free association. That's what I'm getting at here. Now, here's Seth's bio. Seth Lorinczi is a Portland-based writer who focuses on psychedelics, music, and culture. His writing appears in The Guardian, Maggot Brain, Double Blind, Narratively, Portland Monthly, The San Francisco Chronicle, and Portland Oregonian, as well as entries and anthologies by Hozak Books and Akashic Books and other publications. Death Trip is his first book. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Seth Lorinczi. Tell me about change. Change. We were talking before we started about the code that we start out with. One of my big questions for myself, if none of my guests, can man change? Or do we just get back to who we were?
Right.
Who we were supposed to be? Can we mutate?
I do believe that. Even despite, I turned 54.
A month after I turned 54.
There you go. And so in many ways, I feel like I'm walking around, especially being back on the East Coast where I'm from. I'm walking around this abandoned mansion and finding all these rooms I'd forgotten. Like, oh, part of me lives in here. Part of me lives in here. I'm in New York where I've been coming since the mid-'70s. Like, oh, right, some part of me belongs here. Some long-lost part of me belongs here. So even as I'm sort of taking stock and returning to myself in that sense, I do believe that we do change and we can change. And I say that because I'm throwing myself a lifeline, very much so. But B, look, I don't know what tradition this comes from, and it probably is native to many traditions, but this idea that every third generation, someone comes to upend the family myths, the family stories, the things that say this is who we are and this is how we move through the world. And, my book is very much about uncovering buried family stories so that I and my family and the people I love and the people who will come after me can have a different experience of life. They feel like they aren't bound by these codes of unmetabolized trauma or untouched grief. So, yeah, the answer is yes, we can change. Please, hopefully.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
How did you change over the course of this book?
I mean, it's a trope, but the book wrote me as much as...
Yeah, it's very much a book about the writing of itself.
Yeah, yeah, no joke. I was also not a writer when I started. I mean, I was a writer by trade. I was a journalist and a copywriter, but I had written exactly one piece of personal writing before this. And when this project sucked me in and I realized I have to do this or I think my life might be over, and I'm not being dramatic here. I had to take myself down to the studs. Everything I had assumed about who I was and how I moved through the world, how I had to relate to the world, I think especially as a really defended person. I mean, everything just seems so fucking personal. Like everything was directed at me. I was so aggrieved and defensive. And this book, it's an irony in that, the book is about uncovering my family's darkest moments. I mean, it goes into World War II and the Holocaust and some truly awful things. But the gift of that of going into the darkness is a freedom that I certainly never modeled to me as a young person. If that makes sense. Like this is not a way you can live in the world. Like you have to live by these rules. I'm experiencing a freedom now in middle age.
54 is middle age. I'm good with that.
Good. So, thank you. Yes. I was wondering if I should massage that a little bit. That's really unexpected. And, it's changing my life, my marriage, and it's definitely changing my kid's life.
Could you have done this 10 to 15 years ago?
No, I really, really wish I could have. I mean, so much about my life I wish I could have done.
Sure. But
years
do you
before.
believe, you could have written this book and gone through these experiences earlier?
No, everything was a stage. Like everything had to be,
in our hippie-ish Portland way. I'm sorry, go on.
Well, no, I mean, like, I honestly, I'm thinking of like a grain of wheat and like the bran and the endosperm and all the pieces that have to be broken down by digestion before the next one can be revealed. I had my own lifetime of trauma and defendedness. And also I want to say, like, I don't believe my personal story is very remarkable at all. But on top of that, there's generations that came before me. I mean, for instance, like, we haven't talked about Judaism, But I realized during the writing of this book, I'm not at all the first member of my family to sort of, I don't know, renounce, step away from, however, Judaism. I'm at least the fourth. I mean, it's generation after generation after generation changing their names, changing their addresses, changing their appearance, changing their marriages to avoid this central core piece of whom they are.
Because to them, we'll always be Jewish. We'll always be Jews, not Jewish.
Right, exactly. Different.
It's something I've tried to convey to my wife, who's Gentile, that for everything, there will always be, yes, but he's a Jew.
Right.
It doesn't matter whether you're practicing or not. As we were raised, as I'm sure you had the same vibe.
Yeah.
We'll still get marched off to the camps at some point. My family, I'm also first generation American. Father, Romania, Bucharest, 1937. Mom, Britain or London, 1940. But we were raised with.
Yeah, there's that imprint.
You're always going to be hauled away. So be prepared for the next one.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, one of the deep ironies, and obviously I write about this in the book, that I grew up in a household made of books. Like literally every wall had built-in shelves and rows and rows and rows of books. Thousands of them on the experience of trauma, war, dislocation, the Holocaust. And yet no one ever explained explicitly, this is how our story fits in. And there's so much avoidance and darkness and sort of cloaking around it that it guaranteed that it would take on this, this sort of giant looming presence because, what's the horror film trope? The thing not seen is the thing that we always have to keep our mind on. I wish so much that people who had raised me had the wherewithal to touch on that, to touch on their own unmetabolized grief, but to be explicit. Like, this is where we came from, this is who we are, and we need to find a way of making sense of that. And instead, it was this sort of unspoken thing in the background. And
I think from the sheer depths of the horror that you convey of their stories, you can understand why it wasn't a, hey, son, let me tell you about what we went through in 1944, 45, even beyond. That it's just, they're protecting us in a way, but there's also a sense of they're protecting themselves from...
They're protecting themselves, absolutely.
The trauma.
And as I'm sure you know, I mean, people who survive those experiences tend to fall into one of two camps. They shut an iron gate on it, and it's locked away forever, or they will not shut up about it. Right? And I hear both.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, our understanding of how trauma works is very much evolving. This is a sidebar, but there's a filmmaker named Michael Galinsky who has, in some ways, similar backgrounds to us. It's funny, he and I both came up in the same music scene, and I don't think we've ever met, although it's probable we were in the same room. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But he's a brilliant photographer and a filmmaker, and one of his the film that's touched me the most is called Saved by Sarno, All the Rage. And it's about... Oh,
okay. Yeah. I was wondering why his name was familiar. I had a neck and back issue last year, and one of my guests was like, I'm in this movie. You need to... Well, he filled me in on Sarno, then filled me in on the documentary because he himself he appears in it. So, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Every single time I mention the movie at a book event, a couple hands go by. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But Sarno was, I think in a modern sense, the first trauma-informed physician. He's basically saying, look, there's nothing wrong with your body. Yeah, there's some anomalies here and there. That's not it. Like, there is something deeper than this, and it's psychological, and you need to find a way to touch on it. And here's some tools to help, by the way. And the tragedy, he passed away a couple of years ago. He was a pariah. I mean, he worked in... a giant medical building. I forget the university he was associated with, a few miles from where we're sitting right now. But, he was totally shunned by the medical establishment for obvious reasons. His books have sold millions.
I bought one myself after my guest filled me in on it. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, he's going against the rising tide. Oh, no, we need more meds. No. We need carpal tunnel is the thing.
More MRIs and CT
Imaging,
scans and
meds,
everything else, and everything is billable under
you.
insurance and Medicare. So.
Yeah.
But Galinsky, you were saying?
Anyway, we have this conversation a lot about how trauma is informing us now. And of course, it can go way too far. There's a point to be made that the language, the vernacular of trauma has found its way into every conversation.
Sure. And most TV shows are now, there's deep trauma behind each character. It's like, they can be people too. But
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, here's something else I want to point out. I mean, my very first synagogue appearance, and that was kind of a trip too, because someone who had not set foot inside a synagogue for decades, at the Q&A, a young woman raised her hand and said, "Look, I'm a third generation survivor. Don't you think there was more to these people's lives than their trauma, right? Like these people had long lives in many cases, and you are focusing on their worst moments. There's so much more to them, And she was really, really impassioned, and I had to respect what she was saying, but I also have a really twisted sense of humor. So she sort of goes on her spiel and she says, don't you think, you need to highlight more than their worst moments? And I paused and I said, no. Next question. And I went back to her, but it was kind of a pleasure.
But yeah, it's the tools that we have, and I'm somebody who has never done therapy, has almost no drug experience whatsoever, and certainly has not pursued the psychedelic course of treatment that covers the first half of the book. The thing that I want to ask as a starting question for that, you go straight from MDMA to ayahuasca. Was there no mushroom bridge in between? You just kind of jump from...
No. I mean, mushrooms occurred during the writing of this book.
Yeah.
But it's kind of funny, given how ubiquitous they are. And of course, I live in the Pacific Northwest, where they literally...
legalized in,
everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I find them terrifying.
Yeah. Again, never done any of this stuff.
Yeah.
I meditate now and start to... get into some interesting modes with like 15 minutes of just silence and a internal mantra, but it's only been a month. And I had these moments reading the book. I was like, I'm sort of getting some of those states, except I'm not, vomiting and spending, 8 hours, sweaty and
vomiting, screaming, wishing you were dead, wishing you weren't dead.
I mean, that's a constant for me. I'm just kidding. But
Nice.
But talk a little about the impetus, I guess. I mean, you write about the challenges in your marriage, relationship, and then marriage. Sharing that on the page, having the trust of your wife and your kid to put this stuff on the page. And then, if you can, the journey into psychedelics and then how that prepares you for the second half of the book.
Well, I mean, the thing about being it is an extremely vulnerable book, for sure. And I think it hits those two, my wife and my daughter, most in a way, because they were dragged into this with their sign off, I need to say.
Sure. I have buy-in written here. Exactly. How much buy-in did he actually get from the money?
Very explicit. Very explicit. But look, my wife is an incredibly empathic and generous person, and she recognized that nothing less than taking myself and taking our relationship down to the studs was going to change anything. Like that's what was required, all hands on deck. And it is very exposing for her, but it's a huge, the effect on my life personally is huge. Yeah. But the effect, like on a literary level too, it means a lot that people who are in long-term relationships, and every long-term relationship is challenging in parts, it means a lot that people read and say, thank you, because I see something of myself in this, and this rings true to me, and it gives permission for others to share their stories too. And I think that's a big deal. The thing about psychedelics is, as I write, I was not psychedelic naive when I came to... You mentioned that
in your youth you had your fun.
But I'd pretty much entirely closed the door on that. This whole book is a series of after living a life so guarded and defensive and cloistered, surrendering and just accepting that this is the door that's opening. I don't know why, but it is, and I would be an idiot not to step through it, because what do I have to lose at this point? And time after time, I was rewarded by that, rewarded deeply. I mean, a lot of this book is about submission. I mean, giving up the illusion of control. Control, I mean, especially, we're recording this in early 2025. I think the experience of powerlessness is the most universal experience that we're having now as a country and maybe as a planet. Surrendering control to something greater. And of course, that's also, the 12-step Al-Anon thing too, which I don't go into and I don't have personal experience with. But there's something very deep about opening your arms and saying, I don't know how to fix this. I don't have the answer. I have faith that maybe this insane, wait, you want me to sit in a basement and drink what? And throw what? That it would have answers for me. And it did. And over and over and over again. And eventually, not to dispense too many spoilers, but for me, the magic of the book, or one of the magical elements, is that, there are all these fantastical, weird, trippy, psychedelic experiences, a lot of them. But the end of the book, I mean, where the real meat happens, which is digging into the story and finding the truth to surmount it, there's no drugs whatsoever.
No, that's what I meant. The back half of the book is
we'll
say drug free. The vision is there, but the chemical side is not. It's memory and time that you're falling into.
Yeah.
Although, again, the way you convey the experiences in the first half of the book, time becomes permeable. And that's what the second half of the book is that permeability of time as you step back. And I had my own visit to Budapest in 2004. Different time than what you're writing about, different world, but the Hotel Gellert was where I stayed at a friend's wedding. Was out there for that, and just seeing that world and seeing the resonances it has for you in your life and what you're trying to reconstruct from your family's history and what's there and what isn't there. It seems that the first half, where time keeps bending, and your trips, your medicine trips. That's
there had to be a dismantling for me. Like some, call it consensus reality, whatever you want to name it. That had to fall apart enough to see that permeability, the way that after psychedelic experiences, coincidence becomes a huge factor in people's lives. Yeah. And it turns from something like, oh, well, that's trippy or that's weird or, isn't that unusual, to like, no.
That's how the universe is working.
It's always working this way, actually. Yeah. And I think about, for instance, I'm in no way a psychedelic theorist or an academic, anything of that nature. But I think the way that certain animals deliberately ingest psilocybin mushrooms, reindeer, caribou, foxes, wolves. And for me, it's all pattern recognition. I mean, that's what psychedelics are really, really good at. You see the fabric behind what we see with their eyes. And I suspect that's one of the reasons that animals tap into that too, because nature is pattern. Nature is pattern recognition. Trippy or not, that's how it feels to me.
Yeah. So tell me about the process of writing.
Mostly learning how to write.
Yeah.
I was, that's funny. Someone asked this the other day, and because I grew up in the punk scene, which is still very much a core identity for me and a core community, I didn't have any formal writing training at all. And at a certain point, I realized I was going to need a lot of help. This was going to be a big lift. So I asked the best writer I knew if he would join a writing group with me. And eventually found about half a dozen people. That was a huge, huge, huge boon during this, because having a group, I want to say also, especially during the pandemic too, when we were so scattered, having a trustworthy group of writers, many of them very, very brilliant published writers, who I could trust to be direct and honest with. Like, this isn't working. Over and over, there's all these amazing stories. There's all these these interesting ways of looking at things we take for granted. Where's the spine?
Yeah. Again, the pattern recognition.
Yeah.
When they see things in a way that you weren't prepared to at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Between we'll say naivete as a writer, just that you're coming in, and that you're inside everything. Somebody from the outside can look at this stuff and,
Right. And I mean, I would imagine, especially with memoir, for obvious reasons, but turns out I'm a memoirist, so that's my problem.
Yeah. Did you have, I'll say memoir templates, authors that you were not emulating, but, inspired by?
Yeah, I did. I read a lot about that time and place, about Hungary at the end of the Second World War. I read a lot of books that told me how not to tell this story. And I say that with respect.
Yeah, I always ask that one. Are there ones you're trying not to emulate? But I never want to throw people under the bus. So.
Yeah. But I'm thinking there's a few books that come to mind. One is pretty much forgotten now. It was written in the late 40s by a Hungarian man who survived that time. Really, really tragic. He was a well-known writer and journalist named Bela Zsolt. I think it's his name, Zsolt. And he survived the war barely, and he died soon afterwards. He was actually elected to parliament before the communists came in. Anyway, he wrote a book about his experience of being imprisoned. Hungary, I won't go into Hungarian Holocaust history for 10,000 reasons, but he experienced it firsthand. And his ability to transmit the fine-grained details of that experience really, really stuck with me. It was very, very gripping and granular and well told, and told me things that the larger histories just can't. I was also lucky, of course, in that I had a living relative that I could call upon, and that gave me some of that too. But there's two other modern books, actually, and they're both, it's funny, like I'm looking out the window because they're both within a couple miles of us. There's a guy named Alex Halberstadt who lives in Brooklyn. He's a well-known writer. I mean, he's won like James Beard Awards. He mostly does food and music stuff. But he wrote a book called Young Heroes of the Soviet Union, which was in some ways an unpsychedelic version of my book, in that he was born in Russia, came over in Perestroika, and he's going back geographically and temporally as well and trying to figure out where he came from and kind of what he was handed to. And one of the things he figures out is that his Ukrainian grandfather was very likely Joseph Stalin's last living bodyguard. So just the bargains and the calculations that person had to make to stay alive. You've
seen The Death of Stalin, right? The movie?
I've seen little snippets of it.
Watch the whole thing. It may be the greatest black comedy since Doctor Strangelove. But anyway, back to Stalin's bodyguard.
So Young Heroes was it's a moving book. It's a beautiful book. Again, non-psychedelic. And then there's another book. It's funny. My book was actually called Fatherland for years. Like I stumbled upon it and I thought, oh, this is it. Like just a key in the lock, the perfect name. And then a year before publication, a book called Fatherland came out. And of course, you can't copyright a title. Like, well, I'm still going to take it.
Yeah.
It's about a man who also, I believe, lives in Brooklyn, Burkhard Bilger. He writes for the New Yorker, who goes back to Germany to try to figure out who his grandfather was. His grandfather was a school teacher, a sort of beloved public official, music teacher, all these things. Oh, and also an official in the Nazi Party. So he's untangling all these threads. And again, it's very non-psychedelic and doesn't go as near as deep into the emotions as I tend to look for, tend to like. But it's a beautiful book and all about untangling those threads of what are we handed by the actions or inactions of the people who come before us. Yeah.
Did your father throw the I was in a labor camp, stop asking me for a video game thing when you were a kid or not? Like, did he ever kind of just use that as like an absolute for shutting off conversation and childhood stuff?
You know, it's funny. I cannot think of an explicit example of that, but that was very much an energetic.
Yeah.
Like, you don't understand
because Dad went through this, and therefore, you know.
But as I point out in the book too, like that also worked in the other direction. Like there was a moment I remember very clearly when I was quite young. I had Lego bricks just like exploding all over the room. My room was destroyed, and he came in and very breezily said, "Oh, looks like Budapest after the war."
Yeah.
Thinking, like, well, it was a mess, but then we cleaned it up, but it wasn't, it was okay again. And of course, now I know.
Oh, this is what he meant. Yeah.
Very, very, very different.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, tens of thousands of civilians died during the siege of Budapest, and the city was wrecked for years and years and years. I don't put this in the book, but one of my cousins there was born right after the end of the war. He had a lot of health problems, as you might imagine. And it wasn't until he was, I think, about 6, he was in a hospital when he was given the most miraculous thing. A doctor gave him this round yellow object for his health, and he had no idea what it was. It was a lemon. He'd literally never seen a piece of fruit in that way.
This is part of the parents coming out of the war thing. For me, again, 37 and 40. But my mom is born in, she grows up in rationing in England. Yep. My dad is a refugee at 7 or 8, fleeing Romania to get eventually to Israel right around the time of independence. Gets there when, the country's being built. So, there isn't a lot of plenty to be had. And they wind up in suburban New Jersey with kids who just want normal kids stuff. And it's real weird. It's the impact those things have, whether it's epigenetic or not. The upbringing and trauma they have and the things that they hold on to, or the ways. My mother was a hoarder. My father was demonstrate your status.
Yep. Anyway,
you came to America. I have to get the flashy car. I have to do this and this. I have to show that I've done something. Those things are not normal American behavior. Those are things that, people did coming out of the war in some respects,
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny. Like what subculture are we talking about? You're right. That's not normal at all. And yet those threads are so apparent in all the stories that I examine. Right. I don't put this in the book, but he's not a cousin, but he's a family friend so close he might as well be. Yeah. But he talked about his uncle getting out of Hungary after the war and coming to the States and becoming a big success, and then returning to Hungary and sort of being the one who could put on dinner and be the flash uncle and everything. Decades later, when he visited the U.S., he realized his uncle lived in a trailer park outside Los Angeles. But as far as everyone in Hungary was concerned, no, he was an absolute success. Like, he's the star. He made
exchange rates and everything else. You could the money would go a lot far. Even my 2004 trip, the story I always tell, the Hotel Gellert, they had 2 spas underneath with the springs. They had the complimentary massage for people staying in the hotel, which is the big burly guys with giant mustaches. Yep. And then they had Thai massage. And none of this is going to lead to a sexual story. It's just a Thai massage. And these little tiny Asian women who literally walked on my back as part of this whole thing. And it all came out to 90 minutes for $50. And I was just like, that's way too cheap. I have to give you money. They were embarrassed by how much I was tipping. I was like, no, really, this is,
really.
you are doing over and above what we would pay, in New York. It's just, you could be flash, you could show up even if you're mid-tier American. But yeah, there's that sense. My father never went back to Romania. There was never an interest, did go back to Israel a lot, where his family stayed. But yeah, there's a degree of what they try to do, and then what we carry with us in terms of positive or negative lessons. I guess.
Yeah. I mean, think about the visible masks we wear, and then the invisible ones, and the imprints those leave. Again, like those. There's a phrase I use. I think I included in the book, but wires and pulleys. Like I'll sort of like move my arms. Like, who's doing that? Like, who's moving those? Whose lines am I reading? And there are these moments, again, you name the sense of sort of time stretching or dissolving, when you see through the layers and you understand, maybe that's not even me. And where did that come from?
And have you changed since? Since finishing, since publishing?
Yeah. Yeah, you may know this, but when you're drafting a book, it turns out there's no one standing next to you saying, "You did it, great sentence.
Yeah.
You now write 75,000 more great sentences." It's very lonely. And this book took a long time, years and years. All told, about 8 years.
Yeah.
Which I also understand is actually about normal for a first book,
Sure.
which was a relief, frankly, because I thought I was doing it all wrong. But what's happened since, getting to travel and share and be in conversation with it, is the polar opposite. Mm-hmm. It has been, I'm tempted to say, the work of my life. I mean, that sounds grandiose.
No, just lean into it. Yeah.
But it is.
Yeah.
It is.
This is mine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's something about sharing a vulnerable and a true story that seems to give other people permission. And time again, I get messages, some from people I've known my whole life, and others I will never meet, saying, "I see myself in this story and I have something to say too." And people write and say either, "Oh, I have these buried traumas," or again, the opposite direction. Like, I have fascists in my close family history, and I'm trying to dig and understand what that might have passed on to me as well. All I've wanted my entire life is to feel like I was part of the conversation, and yet everything I was doing to sort of shield myself from the world prevented that. Now I'm in it, and it's funny. There's definitely times when I feel a shortage of gratitude, meaning a book event falls through, or something, some publicity doesn't occur in a way I think it should. Whatever, like that's the breaks of being a writer. Get the fuck over it. When it does happen, and in some small way it is always happening. Books are, a book is finding its way into the world in ways in which you're unaware.
Right.
It is an immense gift. It's a huge deal. So yeah, it's changed me since.
You mentioned the audience response, or the reader response.
Mm-hmm.
How's your family, both close family and the broader one that you write about in the book? How's family responded to the book?
It's really mixed, as you might imagine. I think for some people it is just too raw and just too revealing. And because my family was split, meaning my father was married 3 times, so there's a lot of wives and there's a lot of different parties. For some, it has been a relief, like the loosing of something that previously felt unreachable or inexpressible. For others, it feels like I imagine it feels like an indictment of people that they loved, which I get. You can't please everyone. You shouldn't try to. It's really mixed. There's a few cases in which identities of people in the book had to be obscured, and I named that.
Yeah, you mentioned near the end.
Yeah, near the end, which is, insanely poignant to me still. 80 years after the end of the Holocaust, Hungarian Jews.
They can't know that I'm a Jew.
Right.
Yeah.
And there were other cases that are just...
Some people are private about or actually, no, go on, please.
Well,
Sorry.
If it were a privacy issue, that'd be easier to understand. It's kind of more convoluted than that. But basically, the net effect was that, another identity in particular had to be obscured, and that's fine. The book still works. It didn't change the functioning. It just changes some of the details. I can't. The easiest answer is mixed. It's been mixed for people who know me, and mixed for my family for sure.
Any regrets along those lines?
No. No. And I'll say this. I mean, the inscription, the very start of the book, I write for my father. May it give him his soul some peace. And I do feel very much so. And I name this at the end of the book too, when I'm standing by the Danube. I do feel that all the crazy, I call them the dangling threads, like all the, there's the tapestry of the family story. And then the closer I look, there'd be these dangling threads. Like, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. Like why would he do that? Yeah. I very much believe, consciously or not, that my father left those threads for me to find and for me to unravel. And that it was part of the design for me to uncover the truth of the family story. Again, conscious or not, willful or not, I have no idea. But I did, by the end of the book, feel as though I had given my father some peace. And that's a huge gift, I hope, to him, certainly to me. I mean, there's a saying in this world, not only in the psychedelics world, but increasingly I hear it in the sort of straight world too, that doing this kind of ancestral work is not just healing yourself. It is healing ancestors, and it's certainly paving the way for those who will come in the future. That's a very woo thing to say. There's nothing provable at all about it, but I feel it.
Yeah, that's what counts, ultimately.
Yeah.
Tough and weird question, only because my father's still alive, but deteriorating somewhat rapidly. Are there aspects of this you wish you could have talked to him about before the end?
Yeah,
he died in the late 90s, right?
Yeah, he died in 97. Yeah. It's funny. I named this in the book, the regret of moments alone with him when I wish I would have pushed harder. But at the same time, and again, I name this in the book too, I did push.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't budge. He couldn't do it. And, it's funny. My father has never appeared to me in ayahuasca. I mean, ayahuasca, there's many elements. And one of them is this sort of time and dimensional travel, communion with ancestors, communion with those who will come next. And some people have very direct feeling communications with those people. My father has never appeared to me in those spaces, which makes sense to me, given his guarded nature and his sort of adherence to structures of authority and propriety. And, I mean, as you said of your own father, upholding status, right? This was the closest I could get to communing with him through the book. It wasn't going to happen in real life. It wasn't going to happen in ayahuasca. So this is my way of trying to make contact with him. Yeah.
Near the end of the book, you talk with your daughter about the drug experiences, right. Or medicine, drug. We'll just throw it out there. And that, things should be her choice, et cetera, but giving her a full idea of where things are. That was, she was around 13 at the time.
Yep.
She's older now. What's her response or reception been like to the book in terms of seeing what you went through, what the family went through?
It's very tender. Her exploration of this part of her past comes in fits and starts. And I know her well enough to know that I certainly can't push it. It's funny. I don't name this in the book, but in 2017, my family went to France and eventually to Switzerland, where we met my Aunt Chupi, who's named in the book. And so they actually got to meet her, like the only member of that side of the family that my family will ever meet. I mean, which is a huge deal to me. My daughter was 10 during that meeting, and she had a notepad out, and she was focused like a hawk on everything my aunt was saying and asking her very pointed questions. And that was one of these sort of fissures in time and space when my aunt is relaying the granular details of what it's meant to survive a day during the Holocaust. Like being stuffed in a stranger's apartment, literally not moving for 8 hours because the creak of a floorboard.
Yeah.
Right. So hearing my watching my daughter sort of metabolize it in real time and take that in was one of those big fissures. And then after that, it sort of closed up. Like she took it in. She didn't really talk about it for a couple of years. Later, there was a film called Jojo Rabbit. Are you familiar with it?
I haven't seen it, but know about it. Yeah,
it's really inventive. Mm-hmm. And that, again, cracked something open for my daughter. I think, it's a whimsical and just a strange story about a kid's imaginary friendship with Adolf Hitler, among other things. But also seeing depictions of people in that situation, people in hiding actively during this time of insane chaos and violence. That cracks something open for her again. So my point being, it comes in fits and starts, and the book is such...
It's a big dose.
It's a huge
for a
dose.
Kid.
Yeah, so I don't push it. Mm-hmm. I allow her to come to me with questions. I think that's the most respectful thing I can do.
Mm-hmm. Does she see reflections in our current era and everything you've been writing about? Or is she a little,
Yeah, I can't answer for her.
Yeah.
Really.
Do you see?
I mean, this is the funny thing, right? Like this is the gift and the burden of having these experiences in recent family history. I mean, the temptation obviously is to say, well, here we are again.
Right.
This is what happened, so this is what must happen again. There's a funny thing. I read an interview with a incidentally Jewish war correspondent who said something to the effect of, I'm incredibly anxious, neurotic, like I'm a mess, basically, except in crisis. And then everything that I'm wired to be makes sense.
Yes, you're perfectly functional when things are going
right,
haywire.
Hyper-functional.
Yeah.
And that's one reason, I don't believe we choose jobs. Jobs choose us.
But they also choose Jews. I'm just kidding.
Thank you. Yes, yes.
This is the worst podcast story I have is when I showed up at the Upper West Side 2 years ago and the guest had died several days before. Yeah. There's a whole monologue about it that I did the next day.
You didn't need to check the mic levels, I guess.
Not at that time, but, when I showed up and found all these newspapers piled up in front of the door, I had this, oh, shit, this is going to go south in a big hurry. In the moment was super functional, helping the police, doing everything we could. Stepping out of the building and starting to walk back to my garage after an hour or so of all this was when it all just...
Yes. Yeah.
And melted down and just don't know how I got home. But yeah, there's those instances where we're perfectly set for, when things are completely off the rails. But,
yeah. So it's funny. I mean, like there's...
We're not trained for it, but it's...
Well, trained or built, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, it's my, again, the family friend in Hungary, who's really family at this point, he has his father's yellow star framed on his bureau, and he showed it to me. And with very typical Jewish Hungarian humor, he said, well, here it is. I can never get rid of it because what if I need it again?
Yeah. The moment I throw it out,
right. I'd hate to have to buy one.
We're terrible people. But, we know what's coming. So.
It's true.
You mentioned something that I'm curious about, the over theme of the whole shebang and everything you reveal throughout the book. You have a line about sons chasing fathers in perpetuity.
Yes.
In terms of what you do, I could eat up the rest of this podcast going into my whole thing, which I'm not going to do. Tell me about your mother. You have an episode with your mother at the end, but you lost your mother very young.
Yeah.
Does this quest exist for her also, or is that another part of your life that still needs to be opened in a different way?
I really don't know. Thank you. And it's funny.
Which leads into what's the next book? No,
right.
Sorry.
Well, yeah. Oh, don't worry. There's much more fun to come.
Yeah.
The thing with my mother, it's funny. I think in as much as I can, I have found her. and also understand that she is unfindable in any conventional sense. Years ago, I actually did a good bit of searching in the 3D realm, meaning contacting people who had known her. In fact, it's funny, I was in New York, this is got to be decades ago, and I interviewed a guy who's since passed away. His name was Julius Edelstein. I believe he was a deputy mayor of the city.
Yeah, the name's really familiar.
Yeah.
I probably read it in the Daily News or something. So,
yeah. And I think he was also maybe president of Hunter's College. He rose to some prominence. But I interviewed him in his West Side apartment because my mother was basically his personal assistant in the early 60s. So I did as much digging as I possibly could to find people she had known. But really, and also remember, like, this is very pre-internet era.
Yeah.
You know, she died in 75. There's so little to be known. Like, families hold that memory and they hold the details, if at all. And there's very little to be known. In the course of the medicine work of this book, I did find her. And there's a moment sort of in the first ayahuasca in which I understand, oh, she's actually inside. Literally, she is written into my DNA and into my code. And it was a place I'd never, ever considered looking before, which seems so silly and self-evident now. I don't know how much more findable she is. I have to be content with the idea that we can maybe possibly commune in those other spaces in dreams. I'll say this, though, about her. The way I metabolize her death is that it's not so much that she died young, although of course it absolutely is. It's the cosmic perfection / cosmic joke that the people who were left behind were Holocaust survivors who absolutely lacked the emotional architecture to put her death in context. Right. It was so re-traumatizing for them. And as I write, what do survivors do? Well, they survive. That's what they know how to do. Yeah. And so literally after her death, the pictures of her were taken down and it was as if she had never existed. And to me, that's the tragedy. And it's also, that is what shaped me, for better or worse, to be someone who goes looking for these answers and has, I think, a tenderness for those who feel locked out of their lives.
When do you feel you moved from surviving to living?
Oh boy. When I fell into what I call medicine world,
yeah,
I recognized that there was far more behind what I saw in this 3D world, and it awakened a sense of childhood exploration that I'd forgotten. It was locked away for decades and decades. That was also a really huge effect on our marriage too, because it's really rare. I mean, I'm thinking of couples finding salsa dancing in middle age, right? I found something exciting we can do. Yeah. Why don't we go into a basement and throw up for 9 hours?
Right. The fact that your wife was the one who prompted it, I take as a good thing. At least it wasn't you with the, hey, honey, I got a new idea.
Check this one out.
Yeah.
But the sense of being on, and it's a grandiose term, but being on a quest. Like, there's information we need here. And of course, my wife is very much a character in the book. I don't really go into what her work was too, and that was,
I know, I was just going to say that she's not, you're not revealing that part of her, and that I respect, in terms of, it's the interaction with you that makes it onto the page. But yeah,
and she very much had her own work to do too, and her own journey and her own depths to plumb as well. So it was not just me. It's not merely in support of me, but of course, because
it's my book.
Yeah, exactly. Here's the book. Here it is in black and white.
Yeah,
but that sense of discovery was really, really profound. I mean, to us personally, but to our marriage as well. And that sense of, there's more to learn here. And that continues, even if the deep medicine dives don't really at this point.
Yeah. Have you continued? Do you do? I have no idea. Yeah, I mean, you sort of allude to it in the back of the book in the epilogue, but
yeah, it's
is it necessary, or is it something where you're attuned in a certain way now?
I believe it's an attunement.
Yeah.
I mean, people have used the phrase, look, once you get the message, put down the phone. Like, you got it. Okay, move on. And I don't think I name it, but there's the final ayahuasca journey, which was, by the way, almost 6 years ago now. The last one I sat in. I encountered a young man who was really kind of in the throes of something, and at the end of the ceremony, he's like, people typically go around and share their experiences and what their takeaways were, and he was so agitated and so sort of grinding on the details of his experience, and he mentions in this sort of very agitated way, oh, and so and so and so. Well, I've been doing this, I've been hitting it pretty hard for about 2.5 years, but I think I'm really on the, I'm figuring this part out, and all I could think in that moment is, if you've been drinking ayahuasca regularly for 2.5 years and you're still trying to divine, how your internal organs interface with the psychospiritual, maybe the medicine isn't working. And which is one of the huge problems with the underground and the for-profit models of medicine work. Because, well, absolutely, there's incentive for people to keep pouring, serving the medicine. Like, well, you have the money, you want to go deeper? Of course.
You'll reach the next level if we just...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it takes a really, really strong sort of ethical boundary to be able to say, I think you've had enough, and maybe there's a different way for you to look at these things that are plaguing you, but this isn't it.
Yeah.
And not enough people have the force of will to do that, in my experience.
Yeah, you really, in the book, you don't go into we'll say tourists, people who are doing this, I don't want to say recreationally, but
sure, kind
of recreationally.
Yeah.
If your idea of recreation is, again.
Yeah, exactly. You're screaming and crying for hours.
For some people, go figure. But yeah, it's, to me, fascinating. It's part of the, Gil never does therapy. Gil doesn't do a lot of other crazy shit, in part because, I feel like if this were an option, I would still probably do the therapy thing first, figuring for me, it would be like a cheat code to say, oh, I'm just going to go through some ego destruction and instead of starting off doing a foundation of.
But here's something I want to
please
sort of float. I talked with one of my writing partners about therapy, and he said, frankly, I like therapy and I could use it. And he's right, he could use it. But what he said was that I'm always constructing a persona for the therapist. And that really rang true to me because I want to be liked. I want to be respected.
Oh, yeah, no, everything is a performance.
Right.
That's yeah.
Right.
So, yeah.
And that is, to me, one of the great gifts of psychedelics is that they're utterly impersonal. They're just a lens, albeit sometimes a very challenging lens, to look through and observe the patterns and the storytelling that we all do on a daily basis just to move through the world. Like we have, think about driving a car. You're not conscious of 90% of what you're doing in a car.
Yeah.
You're just getting from place A to place B. Psychedelics are impersonal. There's no judgment of us. It is just a way to look at those stories and to see that perhaps they are stories and that thus they're not necessarily true. In the course of falling into medicine world, I hate to say this, but it really shattered any illusions I had about the sanctity of the therapeutic practice, because I met many, many therapists in that world. And there are great therapists, absolutely. There's a lot of not great therapists too. And there's a lot of not great therapists who engage with that world as, I believe, a way of sort of holding another certificate, another sort of piece of authority. There's a power imbalance.
So I'll look into it. If you end up, seeing me, in a very, very different mindset than I currently am. I'll say the meditation thing weirdly there are, and it's only been a month or so, and literally there's no training or practice I'm going into. It's just lying down and putting on Music for Airports by Brian Eno,
sure.
and just letting that be the background and breathing. There have been these moments of absolute annihilation that have just been fantastic. Yes. And it's just one of those, you can do that. Because until this, the only time I could stop the voices, and I'm gesturing to my head, of course, is when I took up drawing. When I turned 50, I started drawing and sitting in the backyard drawing trees, and realized after a while, I'm like, there is nobody in my head. This is just the eye and the hand, and we've bypassed all this stuff. So, finding some other avenue that can yield this sense of not the self, what lies underneath, I guess. Again, I've been doing it without drugs, partly because I'm convinced people would do something embarrassing to me if I ever, really tripped. They would just have we'll draw a dick on Gil, or something else, silly, but,
But it is always right there, isn't it?
Yeah, there's the realization that you can just fall underneath.
Yeah.
To me, that's been, as we talk about discovering these things, you approaching your 50s and then, in the middle of them. For me, and this is a story I've gone into on the show, and you haven't heard this before because you don't listen, but that's okay. I get diagnosed with leukemia middle of my 50th year, and non-aggressive, dormant, so I'm at no real risk, but spent 10 days assuming I'd be dead in 6 months. And before I actually went to the oncologist, and they said,
for clarifying.
Because stupidly, I didn't ask my doctor exactly, why are you sending me to this oncologist? I just assumed, well, clearly, you have 6 months left to live. So those 10 days turned out to be real good in terms of
clarifying.
Oh, yeah. Imagine the number of newsletters and stores you unsubscribe to emails from. It's there's a whole lot of things you do when you realize, I'm going to be gone soon. And, so that was one of the first nudges for me at 50 that, things are just taking up art 6 months before and then being told, you have a time bomb inside you, and it's been there all along, as it is for everybody, but you can finally hear the ticking. So yes, I have not had psychedelics or therapy, but I have had some we'll say breakthroughs, or senses of the self kind of getting worn away into something else.
So the other night, I presented to a group that provides psilocybin for people with life-ending or life-limiting diagnoses. And it's so perspectivizing, not a word, in those situations. I mean, there's no simple way to say it. I mean, the 10,000-foot view, the 10,000-mile, 10,000 light-year view. But there's this notion that when we access psychedelics, we're sort of treating ourselves to these wild visions or these fantasies. But for the great majority of people, they come away from the experiences with a sense of very durable hyper-reality. Like, actually, no, what I was shown there was really trustworthy and true. And that persists long after the experience, even if they never have another psychedelic experience again. But that persists. It's really durable for them. And again, especially for end-of-life stuff or life-limiting, that can be a huge, huge, huge gift.
I recorded the end of 23, recorded with this young art critic, Jared Ernest. And he was good friends with the New Yorker art critic, Peter Sheldall, the magazine, The New Yorker. Now, Peter was the guy, when I thought I had 6 months left to live, he was one of two people I said, I have to record with that guy before I'm gone. And I finally was able to connect with him. We had a great, after I got the news that I was fine.
Right.
The best bad news is well, you'll laugh at this one too. My oncologist is this Polish woman. And the first thing she asks me after realizing, what I have and that it's dormant is, so are you a Ashkenazi Jew? In this Polish accent. I'm like, I really don't need to hear that right now, because she's just going to ask for my papers or something. And, but it turns out that's overrepresented in this type of leukemia, blah, blah, blah. Yep. Recorded with Peter that summer of 2021. Recorded with Jarrett. Peter died in 22. Jarrett put out a book that's influenced me in a lot of weird ways. But the final entry in it is about the time he went up to Peter's place in the Catskills with a thermos of a mushroom tea, and the two of them tripped in the backyard and took in the world around them. And Peter died a few days after that. And when I talked to Jarrett during our podcast, Peter had been diagnosed years before with stage 4 lung cancer and my CLL. One of the jokes being when I got up there to record with him in 21, he chain smoked the entire time, figuring,
fuck it.
Yeah, why quit now? You know.
Oh, wow.
But Jarrett talked about the experience and how Peter, in his perspective, Peter was very afraid of death, having been diagnosed maybe 4 years before with all this. And that after their experience together, which Peter had asked him to do, to bring this stuff up, he was ready. They had the experience. He was okay with things finally. And a few days after that, middle of a deadline, goes upstairs to sleep. And that was it. I bring it up just because of the death and psychedelics angle to it. But there's that sense of, from Jarrett's description of this, that this was a guy who, knowing it had been coming for years, nonetheless, had this terror.
Yeah, was bracing his hands against the door.
Yeah. And that he was finally ready, and that this had opened him up in some way to that reality, I guess. Not that it promised him some afterlife or anything else, but,
and I just want to insert in here, too, I said this earlier, my own personal story is not important, and I do really believe that, despite your taking the good time and interest in conversing with me here.
Your particular story's in the book, so I figured I should ask. But,
but there's I've experienced a little bit of this too. I don't have an overarching fear of death yet. I'm working on that. I'm building up to that fear. But when I think back with grief about the particularities of my own story, again, like my mother dying so early and the people around me being unable to put that in context, and the loneliness of my childhood that followed, the psychedelic experience does allow me to touch on the cosmic perfection of that. And I use that word advisedly. I mean, it is perfect because that is how it happened. And even when it seems cruel or inchoate or senseless or whatever, I accept that I'm part of this story and that I'm here for a reason. And maybe that reason is to transmute this story, again, for the people who come after, for my family here and now, or to allow other people to touch on that unexpressed grief. That sense of purpose and a rightness to the wrongness of my personal story, that's a huge, huge gift. Like that is a very tangible way in which the psychedelic perspective has improved my life and my understanding of why I'm here.
Next book?
DC punk scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of hilarious to me. I met with a publisher last night who is an old friend from the DC punk scene. We played in bands together, not in the same band, but same room, same time and place. And it's kind of hilarious and fascinating to me that was the water we swam in, right? Like, people ask, what was it like growing up in Washington, D.C.? Like, well, I don't know, because that's the only place I grew up.
You were in the silo.
Right. Yeah. It just so happens that right now there is a hunger for stories of that time and place. And it just so happens that I'm very well positioned to tell them. So it is memoir, like everything else I write. Me.
That's memoir, please.
But it's about growing up in 70s, 80s DC and what a desolate and segregated and violent place that was. And finding, and of course coming from the household I do, in which there's so much unspoken, but finding a sense of meaning in the DC punk scene and eventually making a life, if not a career, but as a musician, and finding a sense of self and a sense of place in that world. So,
did you get rid of all the recording temple that you had?
I did.
Okay.
You're the second person to ask that.
It's a spoiler for the book, but it sounded that you were de-accessioning a lot of it. I wasn't sure if the whole shebang went on its way. So
it had to. Everything must go.
Yeah. I tried telling a friend who's actually been using psychedelic therapy, who's had some suicidality, but he's a big book collector, and told me that one of the reasons he couldn't kill himself is because he was afraid of what his kids would do with his library. And I said to him, that's not a reason, man. Yeah, I told him, and this sounds...
Or whatever
it keeps you on the planet. That's cool. But the thing I tried to convey to him, something my brother went through about almost 15 years ago. Imagine a fire. Yep. My brother's house went up. The family was safe. Everything was good. They lost all the possessions, but it turns out all that stuff was just possessions. I told him I have this couple of books that are irreplaceable that are on the path. He's like, Gil, I know you think you'll stop and grab that stuff, but you won't. The house is on fire and you're going to run out of the place, and that's going to be it. So I told my pal, imagine a fire and find something else to live for. And that's where we hope things are going to go. But anyway.
Well, there's the old trope, your house is on fire. What's the one thing you take out of the house? Well, the fire, hopefully.
Yeah.
That would sort of solve all the problems. But
I did ask Moby this when I recorded with him, and
also another punk hardcore person.
Oh yeah. I was going to say Connecticut. I don't know if he ever made the DC area, but he would have been later, I guess. Actually, no, he's around our age.
He's like a little older than me. We never crossed paths, but I know, there's a Venn diagram in which we both occupy.
And unfortunately, actually, you're both in the Gil Roth's podcasts thing now, so that's something. But I'd asked him, and it was
Gil Roth's bald podcast.
Yes, true. And there's a picture. I could try and Photoshop the two of your heads next to each other. David Bowie gave him a top hat from a movie that he was in. And because at first he was like, no possessions. No, actually, no, I would run back in.
Yeah, you get that one.
That was this is the one thing I have to try to save and risk my life for. But last question, which I didn't prepare you for. What have you been reading?
Oh, boy.
Even what did you bring with you on the book tour, if that helps?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I met a woman at a psychedelics conference last year. I presented at UC Berkeley. Mm-hmm. She is an investigative reporter, and she gave me her book, which is old now. It's about a decade old. What's it called? Bread, Wine, Chocolate, I believe. Preeti Simran Sethi is her name. And it's very unpsychedelic, but it's just a look at some of the foods that we take really for granted because they're so ubiquitous, where they come from and why, and how endangered and how fragile they really are. And it's just a kind of a sweet palate cleansing surprise, really, because I just met her. I think she's unbelievably brilliant. I'm very fond of her, and she's an amazing writer. And I have a food writing background. That was my original journalism career, quote unquote. But I don't read a ton about food, so it's nice to kind of dip into this again, and also to be dipping out of the cauldron of
psychedelics, the Holocaust, and family trauma.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want that to be your go-to,
there's a certain point where it's like, okay, we get it. Yeah. I'm really, really excited to read. I haven't picked it up yet, but the publisher I referenced, his name's Johnny Temple, Akashic Books. Mm-hmm. He just published a biography of a visual and music punk artist named Billy Childish.
Oh, yeah, one of Warhol's guys. Yeah.
No.
Oh, no, I'm thinking of... oh, gosh, I know the name.
Yeah.
And is he connected with the Mineshaft guys in North Carolina?
He's English. He's like rural English. Gosh, okay. But he was just a kind of character at our time, like in the 80s, like in the sort of like worst of the sort of slick synth pop era. He was making really, really primitive rock and roll that basically just sort of pretending the last 25 years had not happened at all. And he's just a really inspiring artist. And I think the book is going to be amazing. So I'll pick it up soon and get it.
Something to look forward to. And I'll look forward to the DC punk scene, because I made my not so triumphant return to DC last week.
Not so triumphant.
My first trip since before the election. And this was one of those. Okay, back to the swamp. I'll run around Capitol Hill and do my thing.
Turns out it hasn't been drained.
No, hard to believe, and yet it's true. But Seth, thanks so much for coming on the show. Thanks for the exploration, and thanks for bringing what you brought to us.
Thank you so much.
And that was Seth Lorinczi. Go check out his new book, Death Trip, a post-Holocaust psychedelic memoir. It's out now from Spiral Path Collective. You can find it I found it on bookshop.org. I'm sure it's on Amazon and other places too. Seth is just finishing up his book tour, but maybe you'll get to see him at an event sometime soon. You can find out more about Seth, his event calendar, and everything else at his website, which is sethlorinczi.com, which is SETHLORINCZI.com. He does a bi-weekly newsletter through that, so check it out, but you'll find out more about his writing, his events, and all sorts of stuff. Oh, he's also on Instagram as Seth Lorinczi, all one word, spelled the same way. He's probably on Facebook and the like, but those are the only two places I found him. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.